listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. Sorry, I didn't mean to cough into the mic. We have a cough button on the panel for just that reason. I should use it. But we are back at the top of the hour here on By Any Means Necessary. Of course, at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be taking your calls. But as always, Jacquie, there are multiple ways that people can reach out to the show. Why don't you let the folks know what that is?
So many ways for our followers, fans, friends, family, and everyone else to reach out to us here at By Any Means Necessary in Washington, D.C. They can do that at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time by calling us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. They can also hit us up on social media on Facebook.com/BAM Necessary, on Twitter at BAM Necessary. Our shows can be downloaded on iTunes, where we would very much appreciate a good rating from you. They can hear us on iHeartRadio. They can spot us on Spotify. They can hear us speak on Spreaker. That's Spreaker. They can listen to us live on SputnikNews.com and on their radio dial at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. And welcome to our new listeners in Kansas City, Missouri on 1140 AM, 102.9 FM, and 104.7 FM. And remember, at 3:20 p.m. Eastern, you can call us at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320 with whatever is on your mind. But wherever you are in this world and however you do it, we want to hear from you.
We most certainly do, and we are happy to be joined for this hour by Ben Norton, a journalist with The Gray Zone and co-host of the Moderate Rebels podcast. Ben, thanks so much for joining us again.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And, you know, Ben, we're at a point now, I think, in the U.S. presidential race, and many people have been commenting on this, I think, that, the order of the day is to stop Bernie Sanders. And there's no longer any pretense on behalf of the Democratic Party establishment that is, in fact, what's happening. Reuters, this is kind of funny, Reuters had a tweet showing Joe Biden and Robert Francis O'Rourke commiserating at a Whataburger. And they actually used some language saying that they were basically meeting to stop Sanders, but changed it. There have been some conversations about whether people who would support Pete Buttigieg would now support Bernie Sanders now that Buttigieg has dropped out and has publicly supported Joe Biden. With Buttigieg, of course, dropping out, Klobuchar dropping out, which is maybe a little less impactful. Obviously, the landscape has shifted some here, Ben, particularly after Joe Biden's victory in South Carolina, and this sort of ongoing effort to stem the momentum of the Sanders campaign is just clearly at the top of the priority list of the liberal establishment here.
Well, and it's not just trying to stop Bernie Sanders' campaign. It's more importantly trying to stop his entire social movement. Mm-hmm. There's a massive progressive movement behind Bernie Sanders with millions of people, including many young people who have never participated in the political process. And to the Democratic ruling class, to these elite capitalists who are funded by Wall Street, who have almost nothing in common with average working people and have much more in common with Donald Trump and the people they claim to oppose. To them, it's not just Bernie Sanders as the enemy, but it's this entire movement, because they understand that the biggest threat to this power structure within the Democratic Party, this corporate power structure, is that movement, is that mass movement. So we should always be clear here when we're talking about this campaign. This is not just a campaign. But sorry, when I say campaign, I mean this demonization campaign by the corporate media, by Wall Street. we should always be clear that this demonization campaign is targeting not just Bernie Sanders as a person, not just his political team, but millions of people who want progressive change in this country, who want to see actual government policies that benefit working class people and not just billionaires. So we've seen really the entire political wing of the Democratic Party unify against Bernie Sanders and his movement. You mentioned figures like Beto or Robert Francis O'Rourke. We've seen even Pete Buttigieg. We've seen, of course, Amy Klobuchar. And also, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, NBC just reported yesterday that Barack Obama has been helping to lead this campaign of unifying behind Biden.
Right.
And specifically, Obama reportedly asked Buttigieg to drop out and to endorse Biden. And he, of course, immediately did so. So it's not just these figures that we're talking about. It's also Barack Obama himself, who they're all trying to coalesce behind someone who is not only, Joe Biden is not only a right-wing neoliberal who strongly supported the Iraq War, who whipped Democratic votes in support of the Iraq War. I mean, that's all bad enough. He's an odious politician, but we have to be honest and just say the reality. And this isn't acknowledged that much in the media, but Biden also has very bad mental health problems. Every time he speaks, it's clear that he doesn't even really know what he's talking about. Just yesterday, he gave a speech and he talked about Super Thursday. So this is it's not only that the Democratic Party political apparatus funded by Wall Street has coalesced behind this candidate who has such bad right-wing politics, but it's also someone who, frankly, is really suffering from bad dementia. So it just really shows to me, it's the perfect encapsulation of how I was tweeting about this, how the Democratic Party, in my mind, this so-called Democratic Party, is not a political party as really anyone in the world would use the term political party. This is really just a political gang. It's a gang funded by Wall Street, funded by the military-industrial complex, and it's a gang that, just like the Republicans, supports every single war, that supports really just continuing these neoliberal policies that have dominated U.S. politics since the Ronald Reagan administration. So it's not surprising, unfortunately, to see that this Wall Street-funded gang has united against Bernie Sanders and his movement. But the fact that it happened so quickly, just in the span of 2 days before Super Tuesday, and we've seen the other candidates drop out, I think it also shows that this gang is very, very authoritarian in its political sensibilities, where they will kneecap you politically if you don't follow their orders.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that this has happened as quickly as it has. And I think we are in a very interesting political moment, Ben, because on the one hand, you got people like Joe Walsh, who was, Mr. Tea Party, coming out and saying that he would vote for Sanders rather than vote for Trump because the Republican Party is now a cult of Trump. And we've certainly seen the GOP cancel primaries in order for the party to just coalesce behind Trump and give him the nomination. But then on the other hand, you have people calling out the Democratic Party, people outside of the Democratic Party, calling out the Democratic Party for their track record of corruption and rigging the primaries in the last election. And then you've got people like Donna Brazile, who wrote a book basically admitting that the 2016 primaries were rigged, now coming out and telling people in the GOP, I think Ronna McDaniel, to go to, I don't think we can say that word here on Sputnik. That just takes the punch out of that, out of that storyline. But basically told Ronna McDaniel to basically go jump off a cliff, saying that, listen, if you have delegates to win, you'll win. This notion that somehow or another Democrats are out there trying to put hurdles or roadblocks before one candidate, that's stupid. I know what's going on, but it's not stupid. We've all seen it. They can't even cover their tracks because it's all out in the open now. So, I mean, in the event of a brokered convention, Ben, which is what this is looking like, what happens to the Democratic Party?
That's the question on everyone's mind. And I'll say there are a lot of folks in the Bernie movement who think that, they're of the view of Bernie or bust, right? That if Bernie's not the candidate, this party, this so-called political party, which I said is really just a gang, needs to be destroyed, needs to be dismantled, needs to be challenged with a new party and a new actually small d Democratic Party that is accountable to the working class, that is accountable to its supposed constituency. Of course, the capital D Democratic parties, its constituency, you would think it's working people, but it's not working class people. It's Wall Street. It's the military industrial complex. It's the same people who fund the Republican Party, which, as you just mentioned, is not really a political party either at this point. I mean, it's always been a gang similarly, but at this point, it's really just a cult behind Donald Trump. So, it's a very dangerous moment for the U.S. I mean, this country has always been very authoritarian, especially for folks who have been on the receiving end of colonialism, of slavery, of Jim Crow, of not having the right to vote for women. I mean, but now it's just gotten to the point where both of these parties are, even to their own supposed constituents, telling them to jump off a bridge, telling them, oh, we're not even going to go through the ritual of pretending to have a primary for the Republicans, or, okay, yeah, we're going to go through all this democratic process, but at the end of the day, if Bernie Sanders wins the plurality of votes, we're just going to steal the nomination from him. And let's keep in mind here that folks on MSNBC who are part of this Democratic Party apparatus, they even said that the party is willing to withstand the damage that a brokered convention would do. So they are acknowledging the fact that it could potentially sabotage their own political party, and they're still going along with it because for them, it is worse to have a social democrat, Bernie Sanders, be president. And we should always keep this in mind that Bernie Sanders is portrayed as such a radical. In most of the world, his policies are mainstream. In the 1960s, his policies would have been mainstream. We can't forget that it was Richard Nixon himself, the Republican president, who said we are all Keynesians now. This neoliberal era we live in of insane, uncontrolled ultra-capitalism, where the solution to every problem in the world is just privatization in the free market, that is a post-Cold War political hegemonic view. And even in the 1960s, Republicans agreed with many of the policies that Bernie Sanders are proposing. It shows how far right the U.S. political system has moved. And the Democratic Party has played a leading role in pushing, not pulling, pushing actively the U.S. political system more and more to the right, to such a degree now that the party is willing to commit suicide to prevent a social democrat calling for basic policies of universal health care and education to be destroyed.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case, Ben. And it's wild to see where a lot of this, this animus or this criticism of Sanders is even coming from. I mean, we know about the history and orientation of the folks within the DNC, certainly the folks put up for the Democratic National Committee as being, sort of staunchly anti-progressive liberals and, people who support regime change and things like that. But even I think that extends, to, talking heads or pundits on a lot of mainstream media platforms. I mean, Anna Navarro comes to mind, someone who's been sort of a prominent anti-Sanders voice on mainstream media. And she's someone who has a history of supporting, right-wing Latin American governments, the Contras of Nicaragua. And I know you've done some work around this for the Gray Zone. But, I mean, when we look into the histories and politics of a lot of these people, I mean, it's no surprise that they can't really countenance someone like Bernie Sanders. I mean, I think from their perspective, you don't have to be this kind of, militant, revolutionary sort of person to really be a threat. Anything that sort of steps outside this kind of neoliberal type of economics is sort of offensive enough. But when we see, the connections between some of these people in other sorts of movements in Latin America and other parts of the world, I mean, it just raises some serious questions about, who is considered as sort of a legitimate voice.
This case says everything about this political gang we've been talking about, of these neoliberal right-wing Democrats, that while they're trying to actively destroy Bernie Sanders and the grassroots progressive movement behind him, they are welcoming into their ranks extreme neoconservatives who support fascist death squads in Latin America. That's what we're talking about here. And you mentioned Ana Navarro. For anyone interested, I just published a long expose at the Gray Zone, and that's thegrayzone.com, and I detailed how this figure, Ana Navarro, who is a regular guest on CNN, she's on pretty much every week. She also is a guest host of the ABC show The View, and is another weekly guest host of this show. And she appears in many other media platforms, ABC. And she herself is a self-declared lifelong Republican. She still calls herself a Republican. And she is from an elite right-wing rich family from Nicaragua who fled after the 1979 revolution. She strongly supports the Contras, these fascist death squads backed by the CIA in Nicaragua. And the Contras executed huge numbers of civilians. They tortured civilians. And not only that, I mean, this is kind of known by people who, criticize her, and she's very active in social media, and people have pointed this out. But I also found in my reporting something even more compromising for someone who's a major political pundit on CNN, and that is that Ana Navarro, in the 2000s, beginning in 2007, registered to lobby with the right-wing government of El Salvador. And El Salvador at the time was ruled by a president from this right-wing party, Arena, which was backed by the Ronald Reagan administration throughout the 1980s, and which carried out many acts of war, atrocities, torture, killing civilians. And this president, Tony Saca, the president of El Salvador at the time, was a very close ally of the George Bush administration. He, in fact, sent El Salvadoran troops to Iraq in order to support the Bush administration's war efforts in Iraq. That's how extreme he was. But not just that. Tony Saca, the Salvadoran president, also was one of the most corrupt presidents in the history of this country, which has had a lot of corruption. And Tony Saca was sentenced after leaving office by the Supreme Court to 10 years in prison for embezzling, for stealing $300 million in public money, in taxpayer dollars. Let's keep in mind that in El Salvador, the minimum wage is less than $300 per month. And he stole 300 million tax dollars. And guess what? When he was doing that, who was lobbying on behalf of his government? Ana Navarro, this major CNN pundit who goes on every week to talk about how awful Bernie Sanders is, to talk about how great the neoliberal right-wing Democrats are, like Joe Biden. I mean, these are the people. They're literal lifelong Republicans who lobby for corrupt right-wing regimes in Latin America and who support fascist death squads. And these are the people that the Democratic Party apparatus has chosen to be the new voices of their movement instead of progressive grassroots activists. It says everything, not only about the politics of these Democratic leaders, but also their own class loyalties. They have infinitely more in common with elite rich Republicans who go to the same clubs to them, who their kids go to the same charter schools, they live in the same gated communities. They have infinitely more in common with each other than they do with actual working class people who are not represented by either of these corporate parties. And the Democratic Party has made that extremely clear by trying to do everything it can to destroy one of the only candidates in decades who is trying to speak on behalf of working class people.
Definitely. Well, we're going to move to our first break of the hour here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., but we will be back. So please stay with us.
By any means necessary.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
We call Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan the most disruptive radio show in America.
It's a great show, and we have a lot of fun.
We come to you live from Washington, D.C. every Monday through Friday morning.
What I like best is that we bring in experts from all over the world. From Barcelona, from Egypt, from Seoul, South Korea.
From Newark, New Jersey. We try to bring people great guests, great calls from our listeners, and, of course, stupid jokes. And we do it with two hosts that have very different viewpoints. Now, here's the thing, Garland. A lot of people would think you and I would just argue. I mean, I'm a Republican Trump supporter.
And, of course, I am a progressive Democrat Bernie Sanders supporter.
The surprising thing is how much we actually agree on.
And you won't be surprised because you're going to find out just how much you agree and just how much you enjoy this show.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. Phone lines are now open, 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. Myself and Jacquie Luqman continue to be joined by Ben Norton as we keep things rolling.
You know, Ben, something you said right before the break just kind of sparked something. You know, you talked about how these elite Democrats are friends in the same neighborhood, go send their kids to the same schools with, you know, these elite right-wing Republicans who support like literal death squads in foreign countries. And they have for years and years and decades. And then I thought about the fact that the things that people who are supporting Bernie Sanders are fighting for are literally life and death issues for working people. The right to affordable health care is a life and death issue. The right for working people to be able to afford child care so they can go to work, being able to afford a place to live is a life and death issue. So then when you think about it, at least when I think about it in those terms, Ben, now it makes sense. It ought to be clearer to people, I think, that it makes perfect sense that these establishment Democrats do not care if working class and poor Americans live or die, because they don't think it's a big deal that their rich friends in the Republican Party are supportive of death squads in other countries. I mean, it's a game to them. They see those types of things as a difference of political opinion and not really a life and death struggle that it really is for the rest of us. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's exactly right. And it's not just a matter of opinion. You know, in U.S. politics, we always talk about, and the media is guilty of this, we always talk about politics in terms of opinion, but not interest. Because the whole point of corporate media outlets in the U.S., as reflecting the billionaires who own them and who make money off of them, is that they shape ideology in a way that's not going to challenge that same system that allows these billionaires to make so much money. But if people had class consciousness, they would see that politics is not guided so much by opinion, but by people's interests. So you hear so many stories of people saying, no, don't make Bernie Sanders a Democratic candidate or you're going to force me to vote for Donald Trump. No one is forcing you. It's your own class interests. It's these upper middle class and above, these people who make $200, $300, $400 plus $1,000 a year, who their interests are they don't want to rise in taxation. They don't want to lose all these other things. They don't want to take themselves down to the level of having to have the same healthcare coverage as poor and working class people, because they are the elites who believe that they're so much better than everyone. They're so superior. They went to Harvard and Yale, and they let it all out of the bag when they say, you're going to force me to vote for Donald Trump. No, you support the policies, you prefer the policies of a right-wing Republican like Donald Trump, who's going to cut your taxes, over a moderate social Democrat like Bernie Sanders, who again is not far left at all. In much of the world, he would be center left. So we have to think about politics constantly in terms of those interests, because when you do, you realize that pretty much everyone talking to us on corporate TV news is a millionaire. Pretty much everyone. And many of them also, they live in this bubble in DC or New York or San Francisco, and they don't engage with working class people. They take private transportation. They don't take public transportation. They go in between their office and their friends' mansions or nice apartments. I mean, we really should understand that for a lot of these people, their worldview is just completely different from working class people because their lives are completely different. And the U.S. is a very segregated society, not just on racial lines, which of course it is. It's still very segregated. In fact, schools are just as segregated now as they were when they were desegregated. But it's also a very class segregated society. Rich people don't engage with poor people. Their lives are completely independent. And a lot of these people, they either don't care or they just can't imagine the suffering and the hardship that working class people face, which is why you so often hear them say things like, oh, just get a job, just work harder. I mean, these are just the contemporary equivalent of the French oligarchs, the French aristocrats who during the revolution in France said, let them eat cake. It's just the contemporary version of that today. I mean, they have the same class interests, and they're just as oblivious as the French aristocrats were on the eve of the French Revolution.
Well, I tend to agree. We actually have a caller on the line. Baltimore Charles, what's on your mind?
Oh, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Hey.
This is a critique and not a criticism. Maybe we'll be like King Solomon, who when the two mothers came in to claim the baby, maybe we'll split that baby in half. As far as the politics is concerned, maybe we'll get half to Bernie Sanders and half to somebody else like Joe Biden. But the last thing that I'm going to get caught up in is a paralysis of analysis that we get from some talking heads that we have on the radio and TV who try to shape opinion and what have you. I think we're intelligent enough to sift through the phoniness and to come to our own opinion as to who we want to vote for. But I have really called about Bloomberg plan, the Greenwood initiative. I don't think that Bloomberg will make it through the final gauntlet as far as being elected to represent the Democratic Party. But I do like his plan, and I like his, at least his looking at what happened in Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we had a large amount of people that were massacred by a white mob on the same premise of raping a white woman. And remember that the Gap Band developed a song said they dropped a bomb on me, which was about Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the move in Philadelphia was the same thing, but they did it. But this was a Democrat, the Wilson Good, I believe, mayor who did that. But the Greenwood plan seems to, if he says he wants to create 1 million new black homeowners, double the number of black-owned businesses, invest $70 billion in the country's 100 most disadvantaged neighborhoods. I want to see if that plan can be implemented. Now, I do know he gave like a couple $1 billion to Johns Hopkins University down here in my area, Baltimore, to make it easier for students who could not afford college to get into that university, a track for him. So in that instance, he's put his money where his mouth is. Now, I want to see if the other candidates can deliver and speak to a similar type plan, because we know 40 acres and a mule all the way up to Jim Crow and the Brown and Burt Board of Education and what have you have not delivered for us as a community. That's a blank check that's been cut and has come back uncashed or cannot be satisfied by the bank, what we call a bounce check, according to Martin Luther King. So, again, I think we're intelligent enough to make our own decision, and I thank you very much for taking my call.
Thank you, Baltimore Charles. I'll always appreciate you calling in. Ben, I'll start with you. Any response to anything our caller said here?
Well, I mean, that proposed policy sounds like it could be a good thing. And of course, there needs to be justice for the history of white supremacist terrorism in this country that still continues. But there needs to be many forms of justice. But I don't think that Bloomberg is the candidate who will ever deliver on that. And of course, I'm curious what you all think as well. But Bloomberg has shown again and again that he's always going to side not just with the rich and the elites who are part of he shares the same class with, but also with these white supremacists. We saw that same policy of stop and frisk implemented, which was another form of racist terror against black and brown communities in New York that even a U.S. court said was unconstitutional because it was so blatantly racist, so explicit. So I think, Bloomberg might try at this point to erase his record of overseeing these blatantly racist policies, but he's just doing what all politicians do. He's trying to save face and pretend like he's turned over a new leaf. But if he were to actually govern, I think it would be terrifying for black and brown Americans, for poor Americans, for really everyone who's not a billionaire like he is. And I don't think we can really trust anything that he says. But I do think that definitely Bernie Sanders could be stronger on the issue of racial justice. And I think he should be speaking out more often. And he should endorse reparations and other policies. Unfortunately, it's something he has not done. So that's definitely room to grow for him.
Jacquie Luqman, your thoughts?
My problem with Bloomberg's plan is that it's all lip service. I mean, Bloomberg was the mayor of New York City for not 2 terms, but 3 terms, and 1 term that I will just go right out and say he stole because he changed the rules so he could run for mayor for a 3rd term when he wasn't supposed to. So, I mean, am I going to trust a politician who just straight steals a 3rd term in office to get it? No, I'm really not. But on top of that, he had 3 terms to improve the material condition of the lives of poor Black and Latino people in New York City. And instead of doing that, he locked them up pretty much. Yeah. So it's nice that he was, and I'm being really, really facetious when I say it's nice, because it's not nice that man called his plan the Greenwood Initiative and announced it at an historical Black church in Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where if you read a New Yorker article about the announcement that he made, several members of the congregation and the community who were in the church that day heard the plan, have really decent questions, reasonable questions about whether he is sincere. And one of the main points is what I mentioned a little bit earlier. An 80-year-old publisher, an attorney he publishes the oldest Black newspaper in the whole state, says, look, politicians do this all the time. They come out here and they say this nice stuff and they talk about, how they're going to invest in our communities, and they do a little bit of community engagement. But at the end of the day, it turns up they don't do anything. It's all smoke and mirrors because they don't address the actual reasons Black wealth was stolen. And you cannot restore something that was stolen by like some private investment in some gentrification and some revitalization. That's not how it works. You stole some stuff from people. You have to restore what was stolen to those people or the descendants of those people. And that's the conversation that American politicians and American people don't want to have. And I absolutely agree with Ben and many other people who I've always criticized Sanders on this point about reparations, and anyone who says it. Reparations must include writing some checks. There is no way around that when we have documented cases of land being taken from Black people and actual money and property being taken from Black people. They didn't get a chance to pass that down to their descendants. We didn't get the benefit of that. So yeah, that needs to be restored. That's restorative justice. That's, in court, that's called what is it called in court when you have to pay restitution? When you steal some stuff from somebody's house and you have to pay restitution to the person that you committed the crime against, they don't tell you to go invest in their kids' college savings plan.
Yeah.
When you get a job, they take that money out your check and they send the victim of your crime a check. So like Martin Luther King Jr. said, we're here to get our check, and there's no other way around that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of glad that Bloomberg came up, Ben, because I'm wondering how you're sort of considering his presence in the race at this point. I mean, Jacquie noted that he basically changed the rules as mayor of New York to allow himself to run for another term, not totally dissimilar to the way that, the DNC changed the rules to allow him to, stroll onto the debate stage. And, there have been lots of jokes about the Bloomberg ads. I was talking yesterday about how, when I watch YouTube, all the videos have completely overcome with Bloomberg ads at this point. But I think it's true that he's, trying to buy a kind of space within the consciousness of the American people that he doesn't really have naturally, because he just, hasn't had that kind of interaction with real life people. He has no sort of real kind of a grassroots base. I feel like any kind of inroads he's made has basically been by merit of his personal fortune and what he's been able to do with it. Now, I don't feel that he'll be able to make it over the hump to actually get the nomination. But I also don't necessarily think that's even the point of him being in the race. You know what I mean? And so to have this billionaire in the race continually, and, what we've already been talking about in terms of all this support and people dropping out in support of Biden, I think, again, just highlights a lot of the stark class realities around mainstream politics here in the United States.
Absolutely. And I think we can say pretty definitively that the main reason, not the only, but the main reason that Bloomberg is running is to prevent Bernie Sanders from being president. And I personally think, and I think there's quite a bit of circumstantial evidence to back this up, that if a neoliberal like Biden is the candidate, then I think Bloomberg would drop out. But at this point, it's still looking quite likely that Bernie will have the plurality of the votes. If not, he probably won't have the necessary 1,901 pledged delegates. But we've actually seen some reports that I mentioned earlier that Obama himself was pressuring Buttigieg and Klobuchar and the others to drop out and endorse Biden, which they immediately did. And there have been some rumors now that the same thing is happening to Bloomberg, that they're pressuring Bloomberg to drop out so that the entire party apparatus, Wall Street, all of these forces can just unite behind Joe Biden as the candidate to try to stop Bernie Sanders. So we'll see if that actually happens. But, Bloomberg is not running because he cares about democracy or cares about making the world a better place. He is running to prevent a social democrat who wants to tax billionaires out of existence, Bernie Sanders, from being president. And another quick point. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned this about how, I'm a New Yorker, and Bloomberg changed the laws to allow him to have another term, which is exactly when foreign leaders do that. That's exactly what the U.S. uses to accuse them of being dictators, even if they win free and fair elections. And most recently, this is what happened in Bolivia, where the democratically elected leftist Evo Morales won his fourth term fair and square in a democratic election after changing the rules, and the Supreme Court said it was okay for him to run again. And the U.S. and the Organization of American States said, oh, Evo Morales is a dictator, and then they used that lie to justify overthrowing his government and installing a fascist coup. So, I mean, that's not entirely relevant, but the point is that it shows the double standard of Democrats and Republicans, of the entire U.S. political class, where when a billionaire oligarch like Bloomberg changes the rules to allow him to run again, oh, well, that's okay, whatever. He's not a dictator. He's not authoritarian. But when progressive leftists abroad change the rules to win free and fair elections, then they're dictators and have to be overthrown.
Definitely. I think that's a good point. I actually want to pick up on this note about Latin America on the other side of the break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. But we will be back. So please stay with us.
By any means necessary.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. I am here. Jacquie is here. Ben Norton is here as we continue. And, you know, Ben, just before the break, you talked about basically the double standard and hypocrisy in terms of what the U.S. government deems democracy and how that not only colors what it does here, but certainly also what it does abroad. And you mentioned the U.S. support for the coup in Bolivia. We were talking earlier about Ana Navarro and her connections to right-wing Latin American governments and her support for the Contras of Nicaragua. But, you know, I feel like a lot of this is hardly surprising, Ben, given the United States' sort of general orientation and sort of imperial activities in Latin America for years and years now. And I know also on the Gray Zone, you all have been talking about how the U.S.-backed government in Chile, which has been facing some serious protests over the last year or so, have been shooting these anti-austerity protesters, you know, maiming people, blinding people. There's been a lot of discussion about them targeting people's eyes in general, and even also in Nicaragua about how the United States and the Organization of American States are lobbying for so-called political prisoners in Nicaragua, some of which have troublesome past, to say the very least. And so when we look at the sort of ongoing trend of the United States backing these governments or these elements within these Latin American countries, Ben, it's no surprise then that anyone who even approaches something progressive in this country, whether it be Bernie Sanders or anyone else, becomes the target of such a sort of an intense attack.
That's exactly right. A few things to respond to there. First, the situation in Chile has gotten very little coverage in Western corporate media, and it has been terrifying. Now, Chile is often portrayed by the U.S., by Europe, by these imperialist countries as the great beacon of democracy, a model for all of the region. Meanwhile, Chile has a very recent history of a far-right military dictatorship installed by the CIA, overthrowing famously, and as many people know, on the first September 11th attack, if you will, back in 1973, in which the CIA overthrew Chile's democratically elected president, a socialist, Salvador Allende, and installed the brutal, mass-murdering far-right military junta of Augusto Pinochet. Still today, Chile has the same constitution that was written under the Pinochet dictatorship. Chile is ostensibly democratic, and its president was ostensibly elected. And who is their president? His name is Sebastián Piñera, and he, like Trump, is a billionaire oligarch, this right-wing elite who has no regard for average working people. And since last year, people have been rising up protesting the brutal austerity and neoliberal policies of this government, where, by the way, in Chile, it's the only country on earth where all of the water is privatized. This is like an ultra-capitalist regime, and the military forces have responded to these popular protests with extreme violence. And according to a Chilean government-backed human rights group, which was created during the progressive period where there were more left-leaning governments in Chile, and the government created a human rights body, they have been documenting. And again, this is not some independent group. This is a state-backed group. So this is as legitimate as statistics get. And they have admitted that more than 10,000 protesters have been detained in 4 months of protests, and that thousands have been shot, and over 2,000 have been shot by the security forces, and around almost 500 have been shot in the eyes. And there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that the carabineros, which are the state police forces, which are notoriously brutal, have been intentionally shooting protesters in the eyes, blinding them. So let's keep that in mind, because the U.S. government has not said anything denouncing the extreme brutal violence of this Chilean regime. And the Organization of American States also has strongly been supporting this Chilean regime. Meanwhile, in Bolivia, where, as I mentioned earlier, back in November, there was a fascist-led U.S.-backed military coup. The fascist regime killed dozens of people, massacred people after the coup, and there was almost no condemnation. But before the coup, there was nonstop condemnation by the U.S. government and the OAS saying, oh, Evo Morales supposedly stole the election, there was fraud, they're repressing protesters. So this is just a classic example of this imperial hypocrisy, where in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and Bolivia, the few remaining progressive countries, if there were right-wing violent insurgents trying to overthrow the government, and then the government tried to do something to stop the violent insurgency, the U.S. and the Organization of American States claims that they're a brutal authoritarian dictatorship. But when these right-wing billionaire-led regimes in Chile and elsewhere brutally repress people and shoot hundreds of protesters in the eyes, there's not a word of condemnation. And by the way, one other quick point on this. The Organization of American States, which is really just a U.S. puppet, it was created by the U.S. during the Cold War in 1948 as a coalition of anti-communist countries to try to contain communism and socialism in Latin America. The Organization of American States played the key role in backing this coup in Bolivia by spreading claims after the October election, in which Evo Morales won re-election fair and square with more than 10% of a margin in the vote. And the OAS claimed without any evidence, oh, there was fraud, the election was stolen. Well, just this past week, the Washington Post finally, after endorsing the coup and endorsing the coup regime, the Washington Post published a study, a report summarizing a study by two leading MIT scientists that said that they dug through all of the OAS research, they dug through all of the votes, they dug through all of the publicly available voter data. They could not find any evidence whatsoever of so-called fraud or irregularities in the Bolivian election. They said that it was a free and fair election according to everything that they looked at. So that has also exposed, once again, that the OAS and the U.S. government spread a blatant lie they knew was a lie to try to justify overthrowing the democratically elected government of Bolivia. And working class Americans, voters in the U.S., many don't even know about this because the corporate media has said almost nothing about it. And it's U.S. tax dollars that are going to pay for these fascist military coups, overthrowing foreign governments, overthrowing foreign democratic governments. And I think if average Americans knew that, if the media actually informed them about what the government is doing, I think that they would be infuriated and they would take action.
Yeah, and Ben, what that makes me think of really in terms of taking action, it actually makes me think of something that we really talked about towards the beginning of the hour, swinging back around to U.S. Domestic politics and the sort of anti-Sanders campaign that's rolling on here. And when you talked about how Sanders, the individual, you know what I mean, is not actually the target here, and I tend to agree with that, but more so the movement around him. And I think it could be argued that Bernie Sanders is an almost accidental figure here. He sort of came along with the right platform at the right time that struck a chord with so many people across so many demographics here in the United States. And he's someone who's been, around U.S. mainstream politics for a long time as a kind of obscure figure, not really doing a lot of note, also not known as someone terribly active or present, in the different social movements happening in this country as well. And it just seems clear that the movement around Sanders, his supporters, which in some cases I think are to the left of him on a number of issues, foreign policy included, I think the potential for that is not only a threat to the Democratic Party establishment, but really the ruling class in this country, which I think is why we see, so much stigmatization and criticism of socialism really from both sides, from both wings of the ruling class in this country, in the same way that we see an assault on the left-leaning and progressive governments of Latin America with similar politics.
Yeah, you're right. Bernie Sanders has been involved in formal U.S. politics for decades, and he was a fringe figure until just 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember I've known about Bernie Sanders for many years before he ran for president the first time. And I remember when I heard that he was running for president, I was like, oh, cool. He'll just be a protest candidate. He'll try to move the Democratic primary to the left. I didn't think he would get even 5% of the vote. But he's a reflection of the material conditions of this country, where when he ran for president in 2016, there was no other candidate willing to speak out about the fact that the U.S. is the only rich, industrialized country that does not have universal health care, with more than $1 trillion of student loans, with a rising gap between rich and the poor. These are all kind of basic problems, and most working class people in the U.S. just kind of instinctively know about it. But Democratic politicians always just avoided talking about it because they always just tagged to the right, and they assumed, well, workers have to vote for us. They have no alternative. So we're just going to move to the center and move further and further to the right. And Bernie Sanders came along. And even though at first many of us thought that he would not get much of the vote, I think it surprised even him as he began his presidential campaign in 2015. He started becoming very popular and rising in the polls. And that's a reflection, not necessarily of him as a person, although he has been remarkably consistent, and that is impressive over his life. But it's also simply he's saying things that no one else has been saying, no one else in the mainstream Democratic Party has been saying. So we can't ignore the fact that Bernie Sanders is a product of the conditions created by all of these other neoliberal Democrats, like Bill Clinton, the famous third way, the right-wing Democrats who just embraced the policies of the Reagan administration.
Yeah, and I definitely think that element is a big part of this, Ben. And in terms of, people who are sort of bringing a message that these mainstream figures are not really bringing, that brings me to a question about, Tulsi Gabbard and what you're sort of making of her ongoing presence here in the campaign. She put out an interesting statement, I'm sure you're aware of, about the interference of intelligence agencies in the U.S. campaign. And of course, she's someone who has faced accusations of being, a Russian agent or a Russian plant or puppet or whatever and what have you. I mean, pick your word, in the same way that Bernie Sanders has, and even Donald Trump. And so, here we are, a whole election cycle later, and the whole Russiagate canard still having a considerable amount of weight, at least in the political mainstream. I'm not sure to the extent that that's true sort of in the consciousness of the people in this country, though I do think there's still some traction there. And so, I mean, in terms of Tulsi Gabbard and her role here in this campaign, Ben, I think she is just one more example, to say the least, of just how little patience the establishment has for anyone with a kind of alternative narrative.
That's absolutely right. Look, Tulsi Gabbard has been running a protest campaign, and the main issue she's campaigning on is ending regime change wars. And unfortunately, no one else is talking about that. Even Bernie, he's gotten better on the issue of war, but he's still always been a bit soft and weak on imperialism.
Yeah.
But, I think people like Tulsi have been making this an issue, a mainstream issue, and trying to get other candidates to talk about these wars. When she was on the debate stage, she, at every moment possible, she mentioned regime change wars. So look,
the thing.
She doesn't have a chance of coming anywhere close to victory. Everyone knows that. That's how protest campaigns work. But what's interesting is when other candidates who are polling just as badly as her, most of them have dropped out, but when other candidates were polling just as low, no one accused them of being Russian agents trying to sow discord in the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
No one told them that they should just drop out. Like Andrew Yang was polling just as low as she was. Tom Steyer was polling even lower. No one was like, there's just such a double standard. And look, Tulsi Gabbard, she has some views that I strongly disagree with. So I'm not saying she's some perfect politician, but the only reason that there has been such a vociferous demonization campaign against her is because she has made opposing war, and specifically regime change wars, her kind of key platform issue. That's the only reason that she's been so demonized. And by the way, people have rightfully criticized Tulsi for some of her other policies, like on India and such. But by the way, the mainstream Democratic Party actually agrees with her on those policies. The only thing that they criticize her for that is actually different from their policies is the fact that she opposes regime change war, which should be a mainstream view, but of course is not a mainstream view in the Democratic Party, which is still largely pro-war and which agrees with Donald Trump on supporting many of the same wars that he's currently overseeing.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, I feel like we're at a weird inflection point in this country as far as electoral politics is concerned, Ben. And I'm wondering if you're feeling the same way, because, we talked about Chile and the fact that the first coup in Chile in 1973 is something so few people know about. So they don't know that this was not the first time that the United States helped to overthrow a socialist leader in Chile with a right-wing leader. And this country has done this in so many other countries. So we've been fighting neoliberalism and the rise of it and its attachment now to right-wing white nationalism. And I think we have reached a point where we make a decision to change course or we're going off the cliff. How do you feel about that?
Well, look, I've always been critical of electoral politics in the U.S. We should have a diversity of tactics, and people should engage in the most important form of political activity is grassroots activism and organizing people's local communities. But, electoral politics is also a reality, and sometimes it's necessary to engage with it critically. And I think that, we don't have time to go into the complexities of that, but Bernie Sanders might be the only possibility for some progressive change actually happening in that electoral process. And despite all his weaknesses, they're still, and the fact that he's not even that far left, they're still trying to destroy him, which shows that this political class, these elite oligarchs, these capitalists, they don't want actual democracy in this country. So working class people need to organize and fight for democracy in every way they can, not just by voting, but also by organizing their communities.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ben Norton. We're going to leave it there for today on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be back with an all-new episode tomorrow. So as always, we will see you next time. Peace.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington.